She kissed him goodbye in front of the judge. Then the notary handed him the divorce papers, still warm from the printer. Eleanor smiled, a cool, practiced curve of her lips. You were always too predictable, Walt. His bank account showed the last of his savings transferred, leaving only the memory of the lie. The setting sun cast long shadows over the still water, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. Walt Miller sat on the deck of the Prairie Wind, his 30-foot sailboat, the aluminum can of beer cold in his hand. The remote cove offered a quiet that had become his only real companion these past months. It was a good spot, sheltered from the winds that sometimes whipped across the lake. The distant shore was a dark, unbroken line of trees, offering no sign of other people, which was exactly what he wanted. He took a long swallow of the beer, the taste sharp and metallic. Solace was a hard thing to find these days, always just out of reach, like a shadow at noon. His mind, unbidden, drifted back to Eleanor, to the way she used to laugh, a sound like wind chimes, he'd thought back then. That laugh, he knew now, had been part of the illusion, a carefully constructed sound for a carefully constructed life. The brutal truth of her betrayal still settled heavy in his gut, a cold, hard knot. He remembered her lawyer sitting across the polished table telling him, she seemed so in love. Just a shame there wasn't a camera. The man had said it with a smirk, a casual cruelty that still made Walt's jaw ache. His sister Ruth had seen it coming, he supposed. She'd always been too sharp for her own good. You're a ticking time bomb, Walt, she'd told him after the divorce papers came through. You let people walk all over you until you explode. That was when he'd decided to live this solitary life, away from the expectations and the lies, out here on the water where the only noise was the creak of the boat and the lap of the waves against the hull. He had thought the peace would mend things, smooth out the sharp edges of his anger. The peace shattered with a sudden, violent roar. A huge motor yacht, not just large but monstrous, rounded the point of the cove. It cut through the water with an arrogant slice, its twin engines blasting sound across the calm surface. From its speakers, a relentless techno beat pounded, vibrating through the air, through the hull of the Prairie Wind, and right into Walt's chest. The quiet, the solitary sanctuary was gone. A man appeared on the yacht's bow, silhouetted against the bright cabin lights. He wore a black suit, even out here like he was stepping off a city street. He raised a hand, cupping his mouth. Hey, you need to move your boat. His voice was rough, carrying over the music and the engine noise. Walt felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, a low burn that had become his constant companion. He took another slow swig of beer. This is public property, he called back, his voice steady despite the tremor of anger beneath it. I came here first. The man in the suit, Hank, he would learn, scowled. He pulled out a wallet, thick with bills, and peeled off a couple of crisp notes. Look, €1,000, enough to buy you a new spot, maybe even a new boat. He held them up, letting them flutter in the artificial breeze created by the yacht's movement. Walt watched the money for a moment, then took another drink. Keep your change in your pocket, he said, his voice flat. He didn't need their money, their cheap attempt to buy him off. He just wanted his quiet back. Hank muttered something unintelligible, then turned and spoke to someone in the yacht's cockpit. The massive vessel slowly turned, its engines rumbling like a predator settling in. It dropped anchor perhaps 50 yards away, its bright, intrusive lights immediately invading the darkness of the cove. The music, if anything, grew louder, a relentless pulse that ate away at the quiet of the night. The deck of the yacht filled with people. Young women, impossibly thin, moved like exotic birds in their bright, minimal clothing. They were draped around men in expensive shirts, their faces a blur of practiced smiles and indifference. Champagne flutes glinted under the harsh lights. It was a circus of shallow excess, a display of wealth without warmth, a spectacle designed to impress no one but themselves. The air filled with the smell of expensive perfume, stale cigar smoke, and the metallic tang of money. Walt watched them, the scene playing out like a bad movie. He thought of Eleanor again, her own ambition, the way she had always chased that kind of life. The parties, the bright lights, the endless stream of new faces. She had been so good at it, so convincing. He had believed her completely. She had fooled him, every bit as thoroughly as these people fooled themselves into thinking this empty extravagance was happiness. The air thickened with the thumping bass and the high-pitched chatter from Calvin Sterling's yacht. Walt sat on his deck, nursing his second beer, watching the scene unfold like a tired spectator at a circus. The bright lights illuminated the figures on deck, painting them in stark relief against the dark backdrop of the cove. Everything felt unreal, a garish tableau where everyone played a part, oblivious to anything beyond their own shallow drama. He half expected acrobats to swing from the mast. Then something shifted. A young woman, her hair a wild tangle, was caught in a heated exchange with Sterling himself. Calvin Sterling was impossible to miss, even from a distance. His girth, accentuated by a tight, expensive shirt, made him loom over her. Beside him, Hank, the man in the black suit, stood with his arms crossed, his posture radiating menace. It wasn't just an argument, it was an interrogation, a power play. The girl, Elsie Shaw, seemed small, fragile, her body language a mix of defiance and fear. Sterling's hand, large and fleshy, gestured aggressively, and Hank's shoulders tensed, looking as though he might strike her at any moment. The casual brutality of it was clear even from 50 yards away. Suddenly, Sterling's gaze snapped across the water, meeting Walt's. Hank turned too, his eyes narrowing. They had a witness. The aggression on their faces momentarily froze, a brief flicker of uncertainty. The music kept pounding, but the tableau on the yacht's deck seemed to hold its breath. Walt didn't flinch. He slowly lifted his beer can, a silent, mocking salute, a deliberate challenge thrown across the water. Let them know he was watching. The moment broke. Sterling snarled something, and with a swift, brutal efficiency, he and Hank grabbed Elsie, dragging her roughly toward the yacht's cabin. Her protests were swallowed by the blare of the music, and she vanished inside, out of sight. The other partygoers, those who had even bothered to glance, simply turned back to their drinks, their conversations, their own petty concerns. The lack of compassion, the utter indifference to what they had just witnessed, was chilling. It spoke of a world Walt had always tried to avoid, a world where people were disposable, where humanity was a weakness. Walt took a slow breath, his hand instinctively going for the camera he kept tucked away for shots of sunsets and wildlife. He didn't know why, just a gut feeling, a sense that something more was about to happen. Before he could retrieve it, the cabin door burst open. Elsie Shaw appeared, a ghost in the bright lights, her eyes wide with panic. She bolted, running with surprising speed toward the bow, a desperate, clumsy sprint. Sterling and Hank emerged from the cabin a moment later. They didn't rush. They walked with a slow, deliberate confidence, like hunters tracking cornered prey. They knew she had nowhere to go, no escape from the metal cage of the yacht. The bow of the boat dropped sharply to the water, a solid barrier. Elsie reached the railing, her hands clutching the polished metal. She looked back, her eyes darting between her pursuers and the dark, indifferent water. Just as Walt's fingers closed around the cold metal of his camera case, Elsie moved. She didn't hesitate. It was a desperate, unthinking leap, a flight of pure instinct. She climbed onto the railing, poised for a split second, then threw herself into the black water. A splash, muffled by the music, and then she was gone. A few moments later, her head broke the surface, her wet hair plastered to her face. She turned, her eyes finding Walt's boat through the darkness. She started swimming, a frantic, untidy stroke, directly toward the prairie wind. Her face, pale and strained, seemed to plead across the water. Walt watched her, his own anger and cynicism a heavy cloak around him. He had spent months trying to avoid entanglement, trying to forget the mess of other people's lives. But as he saw her struggling form, the pure desperation in her eyes, he knew. He couldn't send her back, not now, not when he had seen what he had seen. The quiet of the cove was long gone. He extended a hand, rough and calloused, and pulled her aboard. She was surprisingly light, soaked and shivering, dripping water onto the deck. Her dress, what was left of it, was an expensive scrap, torn along one side, clinging to her thin frame. Her high heels, incongruous and impractical, seemed to symbolize the entire absurd, glittering world she'd just fled. They were still on her feet, caked with muck from the swim. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and haunted, but there was a flicker of something else there too, a stubborn defiance that hadn't been washed away by the lake. "You'll catch your death," Walt said, his voice gruffer than he intended. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from the small cabin, one he usually saved for cold nights, and wrapped it around her. Then without a word, he started the small propane stove and began to make coffee. The warmth and the simple, practical gesture seemed to thaw some of the ice around her. She huddled in the blanket, clutching the mug he handed her, the steam warming her face. Slowly, haltingly, Elsie began to tell her story. It unspooled in fragments, punctuated by shivers and sips of hot coffee. Her journey into the fashion world had started like a dream, but under Sterling's thumb it had twisted into a nightmare. He'd discovered her, promising fame, glittering runways. Instead, it was endless, grueling shoots, impossible expectations, and an increasingly sinister control. "He owns you," he says, she whispered, her voice raw. "Every choice, every dollar. He says he made you so he can break you." She spoke of Sterling's ruthless methods, the way he squeezed designers, manipulated contracts, and controlled the models with threats and promises. But there was more. She hinted at darker dealings, hushed conversations she'd overheard, things that went beyond just fabric and photographs. "It's not just fashion, Walt," she said, her eyes meeting his. "There's other things. Money laundering, I think. People who shouldn't be together, meeting on his boat, always late at night." Walt listened, a knot forming in his stomach. He saw echoes of Eleanor's ambition in Elsie's story, the way she'd been drawn to the glitter, only to find the rot beneath. But he also saw Elsie's raw vulnerability, a fear that felt genuine, not calculated. It stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a protective instinct, unwelcome yet undeniable. "You can stay here for now," he said, his voice flat, but the offer was clear. He knew then that he was entangled, pulled into a current he'd sworn to avoid. The hermit-like resolve he'd cultivated over months was crumbling, challenged by the sight of this scared, desperate girl. On Sterling's yacht, the party continued, though a little more subdued. The main deck lights dimmed, casting the vessel in a softer, less offensive glow. It was a false peace, he knew. They weren't giving up. Elsie pulled the blanket tighter. "He's getting worse," she continued, her voice lower now. "More paranoid. He has these secret meetings, mostly late at night. Important people. Always with a black book. He never lets it out of his sight. Keeps it in a safe, or sometimes under his pillow." She shuddered, remembering. "I saw him with it once. Names, dates, numbers, like a ledger." Walt felt a familiar unease, a cold sensation spreading through him. It was the feeling he'd known during the last months of his marriage, a sense of something rotten just beneath the surface, something festering and hidden. Eleanor had kept her own secrets, small at first, then larger, until the truth had finally erupted. This felt bigger, more dangerous. He looked at Elsie, really looked at her. Her presence had utterly shifted his resolve to remain isolated. He couldn't ignore this. He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen it. The injustice was too stark, too immediate. His quiet solitude had been a luxury, one he could no longer afford. "All right," he said, looking around the small, cluttered cabin. "For tonight, we stay put. We'll lay low. In the morning, we figure out what comes next." He didn't know what that would be, but for the first time in a long time, the path ahead felt less about escape and more about facing something head-on. The morning mist still hung heavy over the cove when Walt and Elsie sat across from each other in the small cabin. The aroma of brewing coffee filled the cramped space, a thin comfort against the stark reality of their situation. The risks of Elsie staying were obvious, unspoken. His boat was small, isolated, but easily traceable. Sterling wouldn't give up. "He knows people," Elsie said, her voice quiet, almost flat. "Important people, not just in fashion. Investors, politicians. He's got his hands in everything." She told him about the fear, a cold, pervasive dread that settled over the models like a shroud. How Sterling controlled their careers, their housing, even their passports sometimes. "You sign a contract and you're trapped. You can't leave. He makes sure of it." Then she spoke of Lena. Lena had been a fiery girl, full of spirit, like Elsie. "She talked about going to the police," Elsie recounted, her eyes fixed on the condensation on her coffee mug. Said she had proof. Then she just vanished. Sterling said she ran off with a new boyfriend. Nobody believed it. Her stuff was still there. Her family never heard from her again. The words hung in the air, heavy and dark, planting a seed of something cold and hard in Walt's mind. Revenge. Not just for Elsie, but for Lena, for all of them. Walt's own past resurfaced, unbidden. The sickening lurch in his gut when he'd found Eleanor's texts. Her affair wasn't just with a business associate, it was with a man who moved in circles disturbingly similar to Sterling's. A man with connections and power. He remembered the helplessness, the way he'd felt crushed by forces he couldn't fight, couldn't even see clearly. He saw the pattern now, stark and clear, powerful men exploiting the vulnerable, leaving a trail of broken lives and hushed-up disappearances. It was the same story, different faces. Elsie looked up, her gaze steady. I want justice, Walt. Not just for me, for Lena. For all the girls he's used and thrown away. Her voice held a desperate strength. Walt felt a shift within himself. The bitterness he'd clung to, the anger that had been his only real companion, began to loosen its grip. This wasn't about him anymore, not entirely. It was about something bigger, a purpose that had nothing to do with his own quiet despair. He leaned forward, placing his mug carefully on the small table. We can't just hide, he said. He'll find you eventually. We expose him. Elsie flinched, her eyes wide with fear. Expose him? How? He's too powerful, Walt. He's powerful because nobody challenges him, Walt countered, the idea solidifying in his mind. He's powerful because people are scared. But he has weaknesses. Everyone does. He thought of the black book, the ledger Elsie had mentioned. That book, that's our target. It sounds like his whole operation is in there. Elsie considered his words, a flicker of her earlier defiance returning. Her jaw tightened. I ain't gonna be another one he throws away. The words were quiet but firm. All right, what do we do? Walt laid out the beginnings of a plan, crude but logical. We stay hidden, for now, but we don't just sit here. We watch, we listen, we gather intelligence. He's docked right there, he's comfortable. He won't expect us to be looking back at him. We'll learn his habits, who comes and goes. We figure out where he keeps that book. It was a risky strategy, a dance in the shadows, but it felt right. He looked out the small porthole, across the water to the monstrous yacht. This quest for justice, he realized, might be his own twisted path to healing. It wouldn't bring Eleanor back, wouldn't erase the betrayal, but perhaps, just perhaps, by fighting for someone else, he could finally start to fight for himself. The days blurred into a quiet routine of observation. Walt and Elsie spent their time tucked away in the cabin of the Prairie Wind, binoculars pressed to their eyes, watching Sterling's yacht. They noted the comings and goings, the rhythm of the party boat, which never truly slept. The loud music continued, though often softened by the distance and the steady hum of their own quiet vigilance. The partygoers remained a constant, but a different kind of traffic began to emerge, especially after dusk. These weren't the models or the hangers-on. These were men in nondescript clothes arriving in sleek, quiet tenders, their faces hard, unsmiling. They would board Sterling's yacht, disappear for an hour or two, then depart as silently as they had arrived. I know him, Elsie whispered one evening, pointing a trembling finger at a stocky man with a scar above his left eye. That's Victor. He's a fixer. For powerful people. He handles problems. I heard about him. Nobody crosses him. The realization solidified the growing dread within Walt. This wasn't just about a controlling fashion executive. Walt, using his intimate knowledge of the cove and its currents, would sometimes take the Prairie Wind on a slow, deliberate circle around Sterling's yacht under the cloak of darkness. He'd learned to move his boat with barely a ripple, to blend into the shadows cast by the shoreline. One night he drifted close enough, the wind just right, to catch snippets of conversation. Coded language. The shipment is secure. The delivery will be made by dawn. The transaction needs to be clean. It wasn't just talk. It was a full-blown operation, discreet but constant. Then Elsie spoke again, her voice barely audible. You know, Walt, I remember seeing your wife, Eleanor, once, at one of Sterling's parties, years ago. A gala. She was talking to Sterling, laughing. I didn't think anything of it then. Just another pretty woman in a fancy dress. A cold jolt ran through Walt. Eleanor, his Eleanor, talking to Sterling. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. Her ambition, her connections, the man she'd eventually left him for, a man with ties to this very world. His personal pain, his private humiliation, now intertwined with this ugly, sprawling criminal enterprise. It wasn't just about justice for Elsie anymore. It was personal. A deep, cold resolve settled in him. This was a reckoning, not just for Sterling, but for the shadows that had tainted his own life. They realized then, with stark clarity, that Sterling wasn't just a fashion mogul with a dark side. He was at the center of a significant black market operation, using his legitimate business as a front. The models were collateral, the parties a distraction. The black book became their singular focus, the undeniable evidence that would expose everything. They knew it held the key to his undoing. I used to have money, Walt said, his voice low, surprising even himself. He hadn't spoken of this in years. Old family money, land, investment properties. Eleanor liked that. She liked the idea of it, the security, the status. But she liked the idea more than the reality of me. She saw me as a means, not an end. He paused, looking out at the glittering, dangerous yacht. Sterling is the same. He sees people as commodities, something to be bought, sold, or broken if they get in the way. The weight of their shared understanding hung in the small cabin. This was more than just helping a scared girl. It was about dismantling a system, about shining a light into the darkest corners of power and greed. You're seeing how easily ambition can curdle into something truly ugly, how choices made for wealth can lead to places no one ever intends. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The Black Book wasn't just a ledger, it was a weapon, and they were going to get it. The plan, as it took shape in the quiet of the Prairie Wind's cabin, was daring, perhaps even reckless. But it was the only way. Days of observation had yielded enough information. Elsie, recalling her time aboard, drew diagrams on a crumpled napkin, outlining the yacht's layout, identifying security cameras she'd noticed, the usual patrol routes of the crew, and the schedules of Sterling's personal guards. She found a window, a slim opportunity, late on a moonless night when a change in watch coincided with a likely lull in the party's intensity. Walt meticulously prepared his boat and gear. He checked the dinghy's small electric motor, ensuring it was silent. He gathered tools, a small lock-picking set he'd owned since his reckless youth, a powerful but discreet flashlight, a communication earpiece. The preparations felt sharp and focused, a sensation he hadn't felt in a long time. Not since before Eleanor, before the dull ache of betrayal had settled into his bones. It was a dangerous kind of purpose, exhilarating in its clarity. I'm scared, Walt, Elsie admitted, her voice low. But I ain't backing down. Not now. Her resolve, fragile but firm, bolstered his own. The plan was simple on paper. Paddle the dinghy to the stern of Sterling's yacht, find a blind spot for the cameras, climb aboard, locate Sterling's private quarters, and get the Black Book. Simple, but fraught with a dozen ways to go wrong. Before they embarked, Walt wrote a short, cryptic note and sealed it in an envelope addressed to his sister Ruth. Oh, if you haven't heard from me by noon tomorrow. He left it with a fisherman he knew, a silent, solitary man who frequented the marina. The act felt strangely liberating, an acknowledgement of the danger, a final tether to the world he was leaving behind, if only for a night. He thought of Eleanor then, of her cold calculation during their divorce, the way she'd systematically stripped him of everything she could, her lawyer a predatory extension of her will. He had felt like a fool, played for sport. This mission, he realized, was more than just revenge for Elsie or for Lena. It was about reclaiming something of himself, a sense of control, a twisted kind of justice for the indignities he had suffered. They talked through the potential consequences, the silence in the cabin heavy with unspoken fears. Being caught by Sterling's bodyguards wasn't just about arrest. It was about disappearing, like Lena. Elsie's eyes darted around, imagining the scenarios. He has men who don't ask questions, she whispered. Then she added another detail, one that hit Walt like a physical blow. I remembered something else, Elsie said, her voice barely a breath. That time I saw Eleanor with Sterling at the gala, it wasn't just a casual chat. They were intimate. He had his hand on her back, low, and she was smiling at him in a way she only smiled at a few people. This was weeks before you found out about her affair, before everything blew up. The words hung in the air, cold and undeniable. Weeks before, meaning Eleanor had been involved with Sterling, or at least intimately connected to his world, even before her affair with the business associate had become public. It meant his betrayal was deeper, more insidious than he had ever imagined. Sterling wasn't just a general evil in the world. He was directly connected to Walt's own broken heart, a piece of the rot that had infected his life. A surge of icy fury, sharper than anything he'd felt before, coursed through him. The mission was no longer just a plan, it was a personal crusade. The moonless night pressed down on the lake, a velvet blanket that concealed as much as it revealed. Walt and Elsie, hunched low in the small dinghy, moved silently through the water towards Sterling's yacht. The electric motor made barely a whisper. The only sounds were the soft lapping of water against the hull and the frantic drum of Walt's own heart. Tension hung thick in the cold air, a living thing. Elsie, a phantom in the darkness, pointed the way. She moved with an eerie familiarity through the maze of the luxury vessel. They bypassed a sleeping deckhand, his snores a steady rhythm against the faint thrum of the yacht's generators. They skirted the main saloon, where the remnants of the party lay scattered like discarded memories. Elsie knew the blind spots, the paths least traveled by the guards. They found Sterling's cabin, a grand door of polished wood. It was locked, as expected. Elsie, however, gestured toward a potted plant, its leaves thick and dark. Behind it, tucked into a small alcove, was a ceramic bird. She pulled it out. Beneath it lay a small, tarnished key. He's always too confident, she whispered, a grim satisfaction in her voice. Inside, the cabin was a testament to Sterling's opulent excess. Rich leather, polished brass, a sprawling bed, and a desk that looked like it belonged in a CEO's office. It was a stark, almost obscene contrast to the simple, practical sparsenesses of Walt's own sailboat. A quick glance confirmed Sterling was not present. A wave of relief, cold and fleeting, washed over Walt. The book, Elsie urged, her eyes wide, darting around the room. He keeps it close. They began a frantic search. Cushions were lifted, drawers were pulled open, books were scanned. Time was a rapidly dwindling resource. Walt's gaze fell on a large, garish painting of a seascape hanging on the wall beside the bed. It seemed out of place, too gaudy even for Sterling. He pressed on the frame, and with a soft click, it swung inwards, revealing a small steel safe. Elsie gasped. The combination, she breathed. I heard him once. He was drunk. Said it out loud to a girl he was trying to impress. 5, 7, 3, 1. Walt's fingers, surprisingly steady, turned the dial. The tumblers clicked, and the safe door swung open. Inside, nestled among a few stacks of cash and a heavy gold watch, was a plain black leather-bound book. He pulled it out. It was a ledger filled with names, dates, and cryptic entries that spoke of huge sums, illicit transactions, and offshore accounts. Their worst suspicions were confirmed. This was the key. Just as they were about to turn and leave, a faint sound reached them. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and approaching from the end of the corridor. Hank. Elsie's eyes met Walt's, pure terror reflected in them. They scrambled. Walt pulled the painting back into place, securing the safe. Then they dove into a walk-in closet, pulling the heavy door almost shut, leaving just a sliver of an opening. Their heartbeats pounded in their ears, loud enough, Walt thought, to be heard through the thin wood. The footsteps stopped outside the cabin. A pause. A creak. Walt imagined Hank standing there, his hand on the doorknob, checking for any disturbances. He heard a low grumble, then the footsteps resumed, slowly receding down the corridor. Hank was checking on Sterling, as he sometimes did. A close call. Too close. Almost discovered, almost caught. The adrenaline surged, sharp and metallic. They waited, breathing in ragged gasps until the sounds were completely gone. Then slowly, carefully, they emerged. The black book was clutched in Walt's hand, its weight a promise and a terrifying burden. They slipped out of the cabin, closing the doors quietly as they had opened it, and began their silent retreat, disappearing back into the moonless night. The black book lay open on the small chart table in the Prairie Wind's cabin, its pages filled with neat, incriminating handwriting. Under the dim glow of the cabin light, Walt and Elsie pored over the entries. It was all there. Names, dates, amounts, coded references to deliveries and favors. The scope of Sterling's corruption was breathtaking, far more extensive than they had imagined. There were powerful figures listed, judges, politicians, high-ranking executives, a chilling web of blackmail, fraud, and darker dealings that hinted at human trafficking and money laundering. Then, Walt's finger traced a line, a name that made his stomach clench. Richard Thorne, the business associate, the man Eleanor had betrayed him with. The entry detailed a large payment, a commission for a successful acquisition, just months before Walt had discovered the affair. It was sickeningly clear. Eleanor hadn't just been having an affair, she had been part of this, a pawn in Thorne's game, or perhaps a willing participant in Sterling's wider scheme. The pieces of his ruined marriage clicked into a terrifying mosaic. She truly was a performer, he mumbled, the words tasting like ash. Every tear, every loving gesture, every promise, all a calculated act. His personal pain now had a concrete name, a face, and a direct, undeniable link to the man they were about to expose. Sterling wasn't just a force of generic evil. He was the architect of Walt's intimate destruction. The anger, once diffuse, sharpened to a precise point. They debated the best way to release the information. Going to the police felt too risky. Sterling's influence likely reached deep into local law enforcement. There had to be a way to ensure the evidence reached the right authorities without jeopardizing their safety, or worse, having the book simply disappear. "I know a journalist," Elsie said, her voice hesitant. "Sarah Vance. She works for an online investigative paper. She's tenacious, and she's got a reputation for protecting sources. She would know what to do with this. She promises anonymity." Walt considered it. A journalist. Someone outside the immediate circle of Sterling's reach. It felt like their best, perhaps only option. He felt a grim satisfaction, a cold triumph, knowing that Sterling's carefully constructed empire was about to crumble. But the satisfaction was tempered by a lingering bitterness. This expose, no matter how grand, wouldn't erase his past, wouldn't heal the gaping wound Eleanor had left. The emotional cost of this quest was immense. The continuous dredging up of his betrayal, a constant ache. "All right," Walt said, his voice flat. "Sarah Vance it is." They packed the black book securely, wrapped in plastic, tucked into a waterproof bag. The plan was to leave the cove, find a safe harbor a few hours away, somewhere remote enough to make a call, and send the evidence without being tracked. Walt turned the key and the Prairie Wind's engine sputtered to life, a comforting rumble in the quiet. He eased the throttle forward, preparing to pull anchor. Then a sudden, powerful shudder ran through the water. On the other side of the cove, Sterling's yacht, which had been silent for hours, roared to life. Its engines thrummed with a menacing intensity. The massive vessel began to turn, slowly at first, then picking up speed, its bow swinging directly towards the Prairie Wind. They had been found. Sterling's yacht, a monstrous shadow in the pre-dawn light, bore down on the Prairie Wind. Its powerful engines churned the water into a frothy white wake, a clear declaration of intent. This wasn't a chase, it was a hunt, and they were the prey. The party music was gone, replaced by the guttural roar of the engines and the frantic shouts of men. Walt, with a grim set to his jaw, pushed the Prairie Wind to its limits. He was a skilled sailor, had spent years navigating these waters. The yacht, for all its size and speed in open water, was clumsy in tight turns, vulnerable in the shallows. Walt used his knowledge, guiding his sailboat into the narrower channels, skirting submerged rocks and hidden sandbars that Sterling's behemoth couldn't risk. It was a tense, desperate dance. The smaller boat weaving, the larger one lumbering, always just a little too close. Inside the cabin, Elsie worked quickly, her fingers flying across the satellite phone. She'd already taken pictures of the Black Book's pages, the damning evidence of Sterling's empire. "It's going," she muttered, her eyes fixed on the screen. All of it, encrypted, to Sarah. A moment later, a small green light blinked. "It's gone. The world's gonna know." A wave of relief washed over her, even as the yacht behind them gained ground. Hank and other bodyguards were visible on Sterling's deck now, their forms silhouetted, some holding what looked like rifles. The stakes had never been higher. Sterling was clearly intent on silencing them permanently. Walt knew he couldn't outrun them forever. He saw an opening, a narrow passage between a rocky outcropping and a dangerously shallow sandbar. It was a risky maneuver, one that required perfect timing and a deep understanding of the current. He turned the wheel hard, pushing the prairie wind into the gap, the hull scraping faintly against something unseen. Sterling's yacht, unable to make the sharp turn in time, faltered. Its massive bow swung wide, heading straight for the sandbar. A sickening crunch echoed across the water as the yacht ran aground. Its momentum abruptly halted. The engine screamed, then choked, as the propellers churned futilely in the mud. "You're dead, Miller!" Sterling's voice, thick with rage, boomed across the water, carrying over the dying roar of his engines. He stood on his bridge, a monstrous figure shaking a furious fist. "You're a dead man!" Walt stopped the prairie wind, a safe distance away, the little sailboat bobbing gently. He looked at Sterling, trapped and helpless. "Some things, you just gotta face them head on," he called back, his voice calm, cutting through Sterling's impotent fury. The Black Book was out. Their safety was now paramount. The distant wail of sirens, growing steadily louder, confirmed Elsie's quick work. Several fast-moving patrol boats, then a larger Coast Guard vessel, converged on the scene. Lights flashed across the water, cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. Authorities, alerted by Sarah Vance, had arrived. Sterling and his crew, stranded and exposed, were apprehended, their criminal enterprise finally brought to light. Walt and Elsie gave their statements, the events of the past day pouring out in a torrent of cold, hard facts. Their roles in uncovering the truth were acknowledged, their bravery noted. In the aftermath, Walt felt utterly drained, the adrenaline slowly receding. He hadn't healed fully from Eleanor's betrayal, the wound still raw in places, but it wasn't festering in isolation anymore. He had faced something, fought for something beyond himself, and in doing so had started to clean out some of the poison. He looked at Elsie, a fellow survivor, her face tired but resolute. They had been through something together. He saw a path forward, not of love, not in the way he'd once imagined, but of shared understanding, a quiet companionship forged in fire, a future blessedly free from the shadows of Sterling and Eleanor.